Hello, and welcome to another program of Israel Vision. We're so happy that you can join us today. And today we've got really another very interesting program from the Third Jerusalem Assembly. And there's lots of information. If you open your ears to hear, there's lots of information to lovers of Israel, people who support Israel. And this will encourage you and show you how you can support, specifically, first by praying for the peace of Jerusalem. And secondly, by being educated so that you can talk to your neighbor, your pastor, your congressman, your mayor about the importance of Israel to the world and to yourself. Without Israel, do you know that most computers on the planet wouldn't work? Satellites wouldn't work? Cell phones wouldn't work? Just because of all the brains that are here and all the inventions that have happened and come out of this country. This country is truly a blessing. And one of the people who can iterate that blessing very, very well, and probably one of the best ways that I know how, is a man called Josh Reinstein. He's the head of the Christian Allies Caucus in the Knesset. And his message to us as believers around the world is phenomenal. And it will give you a real shot in the arm and of encouragement of why we all need to support Israel. This is Josh Reinstein.
What many people don't understand is that the Middle East conflict, or what is called the War on Terror, or the clash of civilizations, is really a religious war. And it's about who controls Jerusalem. And more importantly than that, it's about who controls the Temple Mount. That's what it boils down to. And to understand that point, we try to underline that message in the name of our conference, but also I think you have to go back to the history of where this conflict comes from, because I think to have a deeper understanding of what's really happening here, you need to understand the origins. In Israel, we've tried the land for peace scenario 22 times since 1948, since 1922 actually, when the idea of Israel was supposed to be the entire land of Israel, including Jordan, when they came up with the idea after the Balfour Declaration. Then it was cut again to give the Hashemites at the time the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. That was the first divide. Then in partition it was divided again. And each time we divided or gave part of the land, the answer came back with war. So at some point you have to look at the symptoms and say, wait, we misdiagnosed the problem. And this is what's really going on in Israel. See, the Jewish people, for 2,000 years, has been surviving the major empires of the world. We survived the Babylonians. We survived the Persians, the Greeks. We survived the Romans. We survived the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, the Holocaust. And we came back to Israel in exactly the same way God said we would. Amen. And if you look at the book of the prophets, all the prophecies have begun to be being fulfilled. You can see it, just open your eyes and walk down the street. The ingathering of the Jewish people, as Gila talked about, from the north and the south and the east and the west, coming from over 100 nations back to the land. What would drive them to one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the world? The desert blooming. Go outside. It's green. We're in the middle of the desert. In 1948, this was swamp and desert. That's it. Go up to the north. Lush green. We're the #1 exporters of cherry tomatoes and lettuce to Europe. We export flowers to Holland. The dry bones of Ezekiel. What is those pictures that you see of the Holocaust, if not dry bones, who's lost their hope and in one day became a nation? You have to understand that for my grandfather, who was in Auschwitz, the idea of these prophecies coming true before their eyes, the idea of a state of Israel coming from the concentration camps, is like for me to understand that the Messiah comes tomorrow. I'd love the Messiah to come tomorrow. Of course, I'm Jewish and you're Christian. We believe he's coming for the first time. You believe for the second time. But I think we'd all be very happy when he comes. But if he came tomorrow, we'd also be very surprised. It happened tomorrow. That's how momentous this is for my grandfather's generation. and your grandfather's generation, your parents' generation. Now, as all these prophecies are being fulfilled, Christians and Jews are celebrating everywhere. This is a major celebration. Just go outside, you'll see tons of tourists and celebrations of Jerusalem and Jerusalem Day and parades and the Feast of Tabernacles and Pentecost and all the holidays being celebrated here. But at the same time that we're celebrating, this fact that the prophecies are coming true before people's very eyes, this is a very scary thing to some people. Atheists, for instance, or the extreme liberals that we see in the university campuses, this is a very scary thing for their children. How can you tell your children there's no God if God is fulfilling every promise he made, word for word? And it says in the Bible that the only reason he's telling us about these prophecies, the only reason he's letting us know that so many years later this is going to happen, is because he wants us to know that it was him who did it. That it wasn't some idol or spirit that caused these things out of thin air. It was God who did this. And radical Islam. Why is the 22 nations, Arab nations around us, so against Israel? We're the size of a pack of matches on a football field. I'm not saying it as a hyperbole. We really are that in relation to the landmass. But how do you teach your kids the Quran if the Bible's being fulfilled? It's not like they both can be right. They juxtapose each other. Only one can be right. So if the Bible's being fulfilled in your very backyard, if the people are coming back like they said, if their produce is blowing up from the ground. My wife always says she doesn't even like gardening anymore because she can throw a stick in our backyard and it turns into a tree in 3 days. I mean, if you have a situation like that, then how do you tell your children, if you're Muslim, that the Quran is true? You have to buy time. You have to say, this is only a passing phase. We're going to wipe him into the sea. This isn't really true. But eventually you got to own up to it. That's a huge threat. And I understand that threat to a people of over 1 billion Muslims. This is a huge threat to them, having an Israel right in their backyard. That's what this war is about. It's not about land. It has nothing to do with land. We can give land and cut land and give more land. It will just create more war and bloodshed because it's who's right. Who controls the Temple Mount? Who controls the ground where heaven and earth and heaven and the sky kiss each other? Wow. This is God's home. It's ours. God gave it to us. And if they can take it away from us, then we're wrong. And guess what? You're wrong too. And that's why people need to wake up now and realize